Good evening and welcome to our conversation today, drugs in the BIPOC communities. What are the challenges and how can we help? What you just saw a few moments ago was an exuberant video of the actor and the dancer who recently passed away, allegedly, of a drug overdose, and his name was Michael K. Williams. Welcome to our show this evening, which is sponsored by LGBT Faith Leaders of African Descent. And we are a nonprofit organization which helps connect LGBT youths to resources. We also facilitate conversations so that we can change the earth and expand acceptance and inclusion. So tonight, for our conversation, we have a small panel, and our first panelist is Bryan Simmons-Scie. Welcome, Bryan. And we're going to give Bryan just a moment. If you would, take 1 minute and tell our audience who you are and what you do. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. It feels good to be back. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bryan Simmons-Scie. I am the founder and president of the Bridge Reentry Program. The Bridge Reentry Program is an interfaith-based organization whose purpose is to increase public safety, prevent crime, and to reduce recidivism by empowering returning citizens with employment, educational, and life skills to reintegrate into society. I have also worked recently with a nonprofit organization as the opioid awareness coordinator, and I'm very happy to be here and excited about this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryan, for joining us again. And our other panelist is Oriana Mayorga. Sorry for messing that up, Oriana. Welcome. This is your first time with LGBT faith leaders. Welcome. If you would, please tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, Ryan. Oriana, she, her, ella. I am located on Lenape, Muncie land. I'm in the northern part of Westchester. I am a full-time student at Union Theological Seminary, which is a part of Columbia University, and I'm getting my Master's of Divinity there, and I cannot wait to graduate this May. I'm hoping to do spiritual care work. Not quite sure yet in what path and what direction, but I'm figuring it out. And I am a native New Yorker. I'm first generation, one of 4 daughters. I have roots in the Dominican Republic and in Colombia. I do not identify, I want to give a disclaimer, as a person of African descent, but I am honored to be here. So thank you so much, RJ, again for that. And yeah, I would say that I've since I was maybe 15 or 16, I've been activated about fighting to end the war on drugs. But I am right now both an equity strategist and a board director at SSDP, which is an organization, a nonprofit. Actually, it's the world's only international youth-led nonprofit aimed to end the war on drugs. And so those are my people. I also help with Faith and Harm Reduction is our t-shirt that I'm wearing. It's a subset of the Harm Reduction Coalition. And I have an extensive background in drug policy and psychedelic reform. So really excited to be here.
Welcome, welcome. We're so happy to have you and your expertise. And I today, for our audience, am Ryan, RJ Love. I am the moderator for today's event. However, I'm also a Union alum, and all 3 of us have or currently attend Union Theological Seminary in New York City. So shout out to Union. So we're gonna start our conversation. Again, this is our conversation today is drugs and BIPOC communities and what are challenges and how we can help our communities overcome these challenges. So as we all know, allegedly, actor, dancer Michael K. Williams died from an overdose related to heroin and fentanyl on September 6, 2021. While he's a celebrity, he also represents the current trend in the midst of our communities, we've seen how drug addiction has expanded over the past 5 years, claiming the lives of Black and Brown individuals via overdose. What's more alarming is that during the pandemic, we've experienced the highest number of drug overdoses in history. And if that's not challenging enough, there are inequities between access to life-saving treatments in the BIPOC communities versus that of white communities. Again, today we're talking about drugs in BIPOC communities and what the challenges are and how we can help. So this is an intentional conversation in which we will destigmatize drug usage and perform harm reduction to create an environment where our community feels more comfortable asking for help. I also want to bring bias into this room and put it out here out front. I personally grew up in the age of DARE, which is Drug Abuse Resistance Education Programming, which is part of the war on drugs, which we all know was designed to criminalize BIPOC communities, stigmatize those who use drugs, educate and socialize youth to not use drugs. And since we know we are now conscious of the destruction caused by these policies of the 80s and 90s as BIPOC folks, some of us have bias against recreational drug usage. And we must acknowledge that and work to destigmatize how we view drugs, period, and those who use drugs so that we can actually be of help and of service to one another. So our first question, I should say, is, and this question starts, I'm pointing this at you, Oriana. To serve our communities, how do we first deal with our bias around drug usage and drug addiction? And before you answer that, I will say, again, I grew up in this time. I grew up during DARE. And so there was this internal devaluation of people who use drugs. I thought bad people use drugs. I thought poor people, low-class people use drugs. And that just kind of like, that was my initial response. So if what it says is, if somebody is in a bad situation, if someone is an addict, they are the cause and they're a bad person. So I'm just going to leave them alone. I'm not going to try to assist. Their addiction is a direct influence of their behaviors. That was my thought. And there may be some people in our audience who think similarly. So to serve our communities, how do we first deal with our bias around drug usage and addiction?
Thank you so much, Bryan. Well, I'm going to have to start off with proposing a different framework. Before I do that, I'm going to say I am a drug user. I'm a proud drug user. I use drugs I have allergies, so I use drugs every day. I use FLoAD every single morning. I really don't want to because I don't like how it feels, but I use it every day. And when I have a headache, I take a leave, and I love coffee. I do it recreationally though, so I only do it on the weekends, but I'm a drug user, both illicit and not. And so I want to just, start off by saying that in these conversations, right, I like to start off by dispelling this idea, this myth that drugs are only illicit. I don't even know. I know where that comes from, but let's dispel that, right? Because substances of all kinds are considered drugs. And the second framework that I also want to propose here is a lot of what you said, RJ, about, thinking that drug users are bad, right? Are low class or poor, whatever the case may be. That to me, right, that sounds a lot like moralizing, right? And that makes a lot of sense. There's been a lot of moralization with drug users. That's because the addiction model that we had up until, I would say, the last 20 years or so, and I could be wrong with that number, has been based on the disease model, thinking that addiction is a chronic disease in the brain and there's no recovery possible. It is what it is. That's you have to stay away from using drugs or else you're always going to have this disease, and it's lifelong and it's pervasive. And that's actually really antiquated and really reductive, because it reduces a very complex issue to biology, to saying, well, I was born with these genes and with these parents and with these ancestors, and so this is what I'm left with and this is what it is. And actually, though, where's the lens around economic justice? Where's the fact that poverty is a huge role, that not having fact-based access to fact-based education is a huge role? Forgive me. Nothing like those narcs. I'm kidding. But anyway, so, there's all these complex issues that lead to people using substances. And I want to propose, and I'm curious, Bryan, if you've heard this too in your work, right? That folks, I more speak about drug use in terms of folks either having drug misuse, a relationship with it, right? So either their relationship is, they're severely misusing it, or they're moderately misusing it, or they're not really misusing it. There's a spectrum, right, of which how I understand and how the people that I work with who identify as harm reductionists, people that are trying to reduce the harms of drug use, talk about drugs. And so first and foremost, for me, I think one of the ways to serve our communities best is to start opening our minds to a different framework that's not based on addiction. And the second thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it to Bryan, is to say that, our communities are always disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, meaning we don't have fact-based, like I said before, drug education in our schools. I had DARE, right? I had police officers, law enforcement, the embodiment of white supremacy, of everything, come into my classroom and teach me about drugs. So I left that experience, like many of us, scared, terrified, right? I'm not going to use this. And then some of us left it like really curious, like, oh, they're going to tell me not to use drugs. I'm going to try it. And that's what they discovered happened with the DARE program, was that a lot of the kids, a lot of the students who received the education actually used drugs 10 times more than they expected, because they were so curious. It was not allowed, right? And so instead of giving children and young adults fact-based information about, hey, actually, if you use this at this rate, at this frequency, this might happen to you, we have young adults using substances that they didn't even know about in ways that are very harmful to them, and vice versa. And so I would say that one of the best ways to serve our communities, especially Black and Brown folks, first generation children of immigrants, is to have people like us teaching our young children and young adults about drug use and destigmatizing it, right? Because the addiction model does a lot of stigmatization. So I'll leave it there.
I agree with Oriana where she left off, that we need to destigmatize substance use disorder or drug use. I love the way that this question starts off. It says to serve. And when I hear that, I grew up in a little small town in Florida, country town, and I grew up primitive Baptist. And one of the hymns that we used to sing is a charge to keep I have, a God to glorify. And part of it says is to serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. And so I feel that we have been called to this present age, and we have a duty to serve. And so in order for us to be able to serve, we have to destigmatize and change our thoughts and our ideologies around persons who use drugs. And one of the ways to do that is to move from stigmatizing language to humanizing language. So instead of saying addict or junkie, we could use better word choices like substance, or a person who uses substances, or a person who has substance abuse disorder. And by doing that, what we're doing subconsciously is we are recognizing that person as a human. We're putting their human nature before any issues or any type of stigmas that may come along with them. And I think that's really important in doing this type of work. We have to be able to see people as human. So that's the first step. is to just change our language. And within this faith community, we believe, that there is power in our words. So when we say things, it carries weight. And so we have to keep that in mind. And I think that by humanizing other folks, it helps us to be more human and to just have empathy for others.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Oriana and Bryan. I really learned a lot just on how both of you responded to this initial question. Drugs has been something that I was kind of afraid to connect with. I was afraid of because, like Oriana, I had law enforcement at cops show up, and they were the ones who facilitated, or they were the instructors. But even more important than that, I love the responses. Oriana's talked about how we, in order to move beyond our bias, that we need to implement or utilize a fact-based model for drugs. And then also that courses or discussions should be had within or by your own community members who have a different perspective. And also to change our language about engaging with substances, change our language to language that humanizes individuals and their engagement, where we prioritize our humanity first. And I love that because as a faith leader, this is us showing love. This is us making space. This is us building bridges. This is us incorporating different ways to reach people and to serve. So thank you for that. Our next question deals with the increase of drug use, and we have a chart for this. So I'm going to ask this question, and this question first goes to Bryan. But why do you believe we are seeing an increase in opioid addiction in our communities? And that started pre-pandemic, but it also reached a higher level post-pandemic. And I'll read some of the excerpts from this chart. And it says, according to CNN, drug overdose deaths in 2020 hit the highest number ever recorded and that's by the CDC. Overdose deaths surged in the pandemic as more drugs were laced with fentanyl, and that's by NPR. NBC News says Latinos grapple with opioid overdose rise as pandemic triggers surge in the US. So these are just a few statements by the media, print media, and television media. So Bryan, as an expert, as one who works with healing and restoration in this area, why do you believe we're seeing an increase in opioid and methamphetamine addiction?
Thank you, Ryan. I think why is a great question. I subscribe to a train of thought called liberation theology. And liberation theology begs that question, why? Instead of attacking people and saying this is wrong, say, why does this happen? Why do people use drugs is a great question for us to be considering on this evening. People use drugs for very different reasons. People use drugs because perhaps they may be depressed. People use drugs because, as Oriana mentioned earlier, it's for their allergies. Some people become addicted to drugs from prescription drugs. So there are a host of reasons why people subscribe to drugs or use drugs. And so that's something to keep in mind as we are exploring this question. As it relates to the pandemic, I just believe that there has been a lot of pain and suffering over these almost 2 years We're in what seems to be an endless pandemic, and there has been much death, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and so perhaps we've seen more increase in drug use because people are trying to find a new reality, and they're trying to escape their current situations. As it relates to fentanyl, fentanyl has increased in our community due to the regulation on prescribed opioid drugs. So we have pharmaceutical companies handing out opioids as if they were candy, and then the government comes in and cuts that off. And so there is a void there, and this is how fentanyl became or was introduced to the streets. And I may be getting ahead of the conversation, but fentanyl is 30 times more potent than most opioids. And so it is a very deadly drug. It's a synthetic drug. And so now what is happening is people are lacing fentanyl with other drugs. So I was just reading a story in the Washington, D.C. area. Two young Black women, they died from opioid overdose, not knowing that they were taking fentanyl. So they had a Percocet pill that was laced in fentanyl, and it ended up taking their lives. So fentanyl is very deadly. It's being laced with other drugs. People are not aware that they're taking fentanyl, and so that may be a reason for some of the increase in opioid overdose deaths recently.
Thank you, Bryan. And before we have Oriana respond, I just want to welcome all of our viewers on Facebook and YouTube again. And I invite you, please feel free to share this event, but also to post your comments and post your questions. We would love to engage with you and know what you're thinking, especially since we have some experts here. Send your questions. Bryan, thank you for your response and kind of sharing how fentanyl works along with other drugs. And before Oriana speaks, this hit me, the fact that the war on drugs, there was Black criminalization, but pharmaceuticals who are run by people pharmaceutical companies which are owned and run by people that do not look like us, are peddling their addictive drugs to people who do not look like us. Because if we know in the hospital system, in the medical system, they're reluctant to prescribe them freely, even as a pain management to Black and brown folks. However, they more freely give them to other individuals. So I just wanted to make that mention to our audience and to respond to Bryan's comment. But Oriana, I want to ask you, why do you believe we are seeing an increase in opioid addictions in our community, pre-pandemic and then post-pandemic?
So, RJ, that question about pre-pandemic, my goodness, that would take a very long time, right? Because that would require us to get rooted again on the war on drugs, which is a historical phenomena that takes us forever back. Let's just say to the Nixon time, although I would argue it goes beyond that it's colonization, but let's just say Nixon and the policies that happened there. Just the mere fact that in our lifetime, literally our lifetime, there was a president who allowed for there to be, mandates for low-level drug use crimes, rather. It's unbelievable. And so I won't go to the about why because it's just too long, but I will say about post, right? So we have, as Bryan mentioned, some data that says, I think it's about like 93,000. Yeah, 93,000. The Center of Disease Control and Prevention said that about 93,000 people died of overdose this year alone, which is a record high. And so poverty, right? I mean, what were we all doing during COVID? Many of us were home, indoors, by ourselves. And some of us had to be with families. Most of us would keep family members and roommates and loved ones. We were in the dark, scared, at home. And again, right, the way that poverty works, some people, our people, have disproportionate access to food, disproportionate access to community centers, disproportionate access to recreational centers. And so a lot of drug users were just home alone. And I remember, thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm going to be indoors for the next year, for the next however long. What does that mean for me as a drug user, right? And we'll talk about this later on, and I'll show an example. I carry Narcan with me, right? And in New York City, I've carried that with me, and I've only employed it on the subways, right, where homeless folks I've seen having overdoses. And yeah, I mean, to go back to the question about why I think, we're isolated, we're scared, we're locked up in our houses, we can't go anywhere. And so how does one alleviate stress? There's many different ways. Work out, you can read a book. Some people like myself love using substances. It's a form of healing, a form of exploration. Depending on the substance you use, right? Depending if you have access to something that that you can test, right? Being able to test a substance requires having a testing kit. That costs money. Being able to test your substance requires knowing that you can even test it. Some people don't even know they can test their supply, right? You need to have a fentanyl strip. You need to know how to read the fentanyl strip instructions and then actually do it and then wait. There's a lot that goes into making sure that what you have is actually safe. And so I'm not surprised that the rates were so high during a global pandemic when we were all so stressed and locked up indoors. And I actually lost a very dear friend of mine to opioid overdose. He was using heroin by himself after being sober for 18 months and died by himself in his bedroom the day after Thanksgiving. We don't know, right? Was it fentanyl? Was it because, like most people who are in recovery, if you just use a little bit too much, your bodies can't, right, handle that amount. But what I do know is that this person was very isolated and very depressed and very sad and by themselves and without community. There were so many social factors, right? Psychological factors that had nothing to do with the biology, right? So I think that our communities have definitely increased their use during the pandemic because we have been under crisis. This is a very scary time to be alive.
Wow, thank you for your responses, Bryan and Oriana. It sounds like both of you mentioned that there are socioeconomic factors. Black and brown communities are already disenfranchised. Many are disenfranchised, not all. Access to care, access to healthcare, access to medication, access to housing, having adequate support, etc., are all factors in why people use substances, but also those are some factors in why some may not survive. So thank you very much. I'm interested in this fentanyl, and you both kind of alluded to the fact that it's synthetic, and that it is added to other drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc., often by drug dealers to make it more addictive, so that they can receive more customers or habitual behaviors. Is there anything else that we should know? Because I'm hearing now, when I hear about overdoses, it's probably been at least a year. Almost every time I hear about an overdose with a celebrity or a community member, fentanyl is involved. Is there anything else that we should know about fentanyl?
Yeah, I'm happy to just define it real quick, if that's okay, for us, because I find that going back to the definition is so helpful for me. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, right? Which is actually typically used to help people and patients in the hospital settings and clinical settings who are dealing with severe, like, chronic pain. So for example, let's say that you have a big surgery after, God forbid, a car accident. You may be administered fentanyl. My mother just had surgery recently, where actually big surgery, where she was administered fentanyl. And I wish I had the graphic, and I'm sure you've seen it, Bryan, like where they show how much fentanyl it takes to overdose. It is like a pin, like a not even a pinch of salt, right? It's like no, it's terrifying actually how little it is. But fentanyl is not a bad drug. Fentanyl is used in the hospital. It's necessary. I want fentanyl if I'm hit by a car, right? But I just want a clinician to administer it to me, my right amount for my body weight, right? With an anesthesiologist. I want all that care. And so I'll just say that, fentanyl is so scary. There's so many reasons why it's scary. Like you said, RJ, not only is it found in celebrity drug cases, it's found in MDMA. Like, it's being found right now in substances that you wouldn't think. I don't know if it's true, and I hate to, I think I may have heard in some website that it may have been laced on cannabis. I don't know if that's true, but it is definitely being used in ketamine, for example, and in MDMA. And actually, RJ, one thing that you said when you were framing the question was that perhaps drug users and drug dealers, forgive me, are using this to get their supply to continue to, increase. I don't know about that. I mean, there's definitely folks who say that, but I don't know about that. Fentanyl's pretty deadly. Like, most people, if they use fentanyl, they're not coming back to buy some more. They're not here anymore. And so there are some people who tend to be a little bit on the more conspiracy theory side. And I must say, I'm so perturbed by the increase in fentanyl that I kind of lean that direction, that are saying, what is really going on? Because this increase in fentanyl is out of control. And nobody's making no profit on it. So what's really happening? Why is there so much fentanyl overdosing happening? And there are some people that think that it's intentional. That Black and brown people, that homeless folks, the people who are most marginalized, the quickest way to get rid of them is to kill them. And the quickest way to kill them is, if they're already using substances, to have them overdose on this, right? So again, that's an extreme theory. I'm not saying that's necessarily it, but it's one that at this point I'm entertaining,
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing more information around fentanyl, what it is, and this is definitely food for thought. Bryan, do you have any comments about this fentanyl question?
Yes, thank you for that, Oriana. You, like Ryan said, gave me food for thought. I never thought of it that way. So yeah, that gives me a lot to think about. The only other thing that I want to mention about fentanyl is the popularity that is gained within hip hop music. And I don't want to demonize hip hop music, because all genres of music speak about drugs. It's not just hip hop. So that's a myth that, hip hop. Well, hip hop does talk about drugs, but drugs are part of life, and so does all other genres. But within the hip hop industry, I'm noticing a trend that there is more talk about fentanyl, and so, for instance, you'll hear the term purple drink within songs. And so this is like a mixture of drugs, which includes things like fentanyl, and it's become popular within hip hop. And so it seems like it's the cool thing to do. And so I think that message is misleading. Most people who rap about drugs are not using those drugs, but they are. It appears that they're misleading the community, and so we just really need to be mindful of the impacts that hip hop has on our culture.
Wow, thank you, Bryan. So you're talking about the socialization and the arts and community, and how our music and culture actually plays into, or plays up, or communicates about fentanyl. as if it's cool, it's hip, it's a thing to do, which I guess destigmatizes to a certain degree and makes it more acceptable to use or to consider it as an option. And I think like guns, like there are a number of topics in country music, in hip hop music, in rap, in pop music that are negative. We just need to also be very much aware of our external influences, specifically in BIPOC communities, because it almost feels like there are so many forces that are working against us. And that's why we are actually here, so that as faith leaders, as community members, we can counter those and work together and love and heal our people back to health. And that leads me into our next question. As a community member, as a faith leader, what do recreational drug users and those who grapple with addiction need from us as faith leaders and community members? That's kind of the first question, and there's a part B. What can we do in our sacred spaces to provide a refuge and resources? So the first question again, what do they need from us as faith leaders and community members? And that question let's start with Bryan.
Thank you. Oftentimes when we talk about drugs and drug use as it relates to the church, I think people feel as if they need some type of specialist to lead the effort. That is not true. There are common things that anyone who has no experience with drug addiction can do in order to help others who struggle with drugs. And so there is Oriana has already spoke about this, but there is a new approach that has been introduced called harm reduction. And harm reduction is a set of practical strategies and programs aimed at reducing negative consequences, and is grounded in respect, social justice, and the human rights of people who use drugs. And so really harm reduction focuses on meeting people where they are. So to the first part of the question, I would say the most thing that people who use drugs need is empathy. Someone who is able to not just sympathize with them, not feel sorry for them, but understand where they are. I live in Harlem, in New York City, and I remember one time I was walking down 125th Street, and there was a guy who was overdosing, and people were just passing this guy by. And I'm like, he's overdosing, but no one cared. No one had any empathy. And so I challenge people to think, how many times have you walked by someone and said, oh, that's not my problem? And it just takes a simple call. You can call 911, get the person help, and be about your day. It's as simple as that. Some practical things to the second part of the question. Some practical things that your church can do is pass out survival kits for people who use drugs. That can include snacks, water, things like condoms. I know condoms and the church are a touchy subject, but we have to be real. People have sex, and so we want them to be able to have sex in a safer way. It can include, as Oriana alluded to earlier, fentanyl strips, so that people can test the drug to see if it has fentanyl in it. Other things are, the church could support someone's substance abuse treatment plan. So if someone needs to go into recovery, the church can chip in and help someone pay for that. A lot of times people do not have access to treatment, and so it will be nice to help others be able to experience treatment so they can overcome drug use. Some other things, possible things are, well, that's a lot, but educating the community, having conversations like these. There are plenty of experts. You can contact your health department or behavioral health department. They can come in, and a lot of times there are plenty of materials that can be that are already out there for you to use, or those departments and agencies will come into your church and host a workshop for you. So those are some things that we can consider doing, and those are just simple things that the church should already be doing anyways. And so those are a few simple things that don't require much energy for you to do. Now, if you really want us to be involved, especially with opioids, there is a lot of grant money out there for opioids. So your church or your faith community could start an opioid awareness program within the church and receive funds to do it. You could do, and that leads to limitless possibilities. You can start a counseling center within your church for the community. People, as we mentioned earlier, people are hurting. Some people just need someone to talk to. And so you can start a outreach program where, people are constantly going out on a daily basis or weekly basis or however, or how often you want to go to pass out these survival kits. So I just think that we just need to think out of the box a little and to have empathy for others. Treat others the way that you would want to be treated if you were in that situation.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you. That's a lot of information. Those were some great tools. Oriana, would you like to respond?
Yeah, absolutely. Bryan, thank you for that reminder. You're bringing in the humanity part, which I thank you for, because empathy is absolutely, I would say the other side of empathy is compassion, right? What do recreational drug users need from their faith leaders? I would say they need their faith leaders to come out about their drug use, because we're using substances, right? So please, and that's number one. Number two, and all jokes aside, obviously faith leaders, we all need to get a little bit more acclimated with language and education around drugs. When I drink alcohol at night, that's a drug, right? So most people are using substances, right? So I need my faith leaders to be honest, to speak out about how glorious their experiences are and how difficult they are. And when they tend to gravitate towards using certain drugs and when they use other drugs. I want to know those things from my faith leaders, right? Some faith leaders, like myself, use psychedelics as a means to connecting to spirit. Not all the time, not every day. It's sacred here and there. Some other faith leaders, I'm sure, use different substances to connect with the divine in other ways. Knowing about that, knowing that there are other people who look like me, who sound like me, who are like me, who use substances that are not like, you were saying in the beginning, RJ, low class, messed up people. That's important, right? To help destigmatize my understanding of drug users. And for the second part of the question, right, which I'm going to reframe. I'm not going to say people that are struggling with addiction, but I'll say people that are struggling with substance use disorder or different types of substance misuse. Just like Bryan said, right? It's a big educational factor. First of all, these little kits, which I'm going to hold up, they're blue. They look like this. This is the New York City Narcan kit. This is free. We can get them. You can order them, right? We can get them. I've carried this thing on my book bag for years now. I've used it once, thank God. Fortunately, I haven't had to intervene many times because it's definitely a scary experience, right? To have to be the one person to get on the floor, to open up the bag, to do the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, to open up the Narcan, to decide, okay, this person, you have to make this decision-making process of, okay, is this an opioid overdose? Is this K2? What's happening, right? But it's something that all of us can be trained on. It's something that the Department of Health will train you for free. And so, like Bryan said, our churches, our temples can employ people to come in and do these free trainings so that we all have a Narcan kit, specifically for opioid overdoses, right? But if we want to talk to our children and our partners and our young people about drug use in general, there are so many people that have great drug education curriculums. For example, SSCP has Just Say No, which I love that wordplay. It's Just Say K-N-O, right? Like it's Just Say No. Come learn about drug use. A great educational resource. The DPA still has excellent youth fact-based curriculums that can be brought to schools, places of worship, right? So when I think about our communities, our faith communities in particular, I want people coming out about their drug use. I want to know that you can use drugs and have a well-balanced, healthy, happy life. It's possible. Carl Hart talks about this all the time, right? So I would say those are the first few things. And then, of course, like Bryan said, harm reduction is about wearing seatbelts. Harm reduction is about wearing helmets. It's about using condoms. It is just a matter of reducing the harms. I drink this water. This is a form of harm reduction, right? So how can we make this accessible? It's not this big thing. It is something that we can employ and do every day.
Very powerful. I love how you explain harm reduction. I love how you change language around drug use, employing different language to remove the stigmas. You both gave some incredible techniques, which started by humanizing people and not focusing on the issue, paying thoughtful attention to individuals. Our human rights, our humanity. You all talked about empathy, and then the flip side, compassion. And then I love the suggestions around changing language in the faith space, around knowledge, Just Say No, K-N-O-W, providing survival kits with snacks, condoms. And I love this conversation, because we're talking about, this is connected to other topics that are stigmatized in the church. We talked about passing out condoms. I grew up in an apostolic church, and oh my God, you don't even want to say condom. Can you imagine that people have sex if they're not even married? So yes, this is like you said, using condoms. People are going to do these things. People are going to drink alcohol. People are going to have sex. This is part of the human experience. Sharing ways to reduce harm is necessary in order to keep our communities safe and thriving. And again, reduce the harm on BIPOC communities, which are already oppressed, communities. So thank you. Those are really, really powerful things. I'm going to ask one more question. We know that there are inequities in dealing with opioid addiction. We know that there are inequities around access to things like what you communicated, Oriana, Narcan. And Narcan is a drug. It's a substance that it's a nasal spray, and it can keep people from having overdoses if they have taken an opioid drug. I hope I said that correctly. And so, however, we're noticing that white communities are receiving training with public funds. White communities are giving access to Narcan. And while there are trainings in Black and Brown communities, they're not as prevalent. They're not as easily accessible. You may have to schedule it individually. However, this stuff is prevalent in white communities, white schools, etc. We're going to focus on that. I did want to ask you all about some of the inequities. You can mention Narcan or any of the other ones as our final question. So I'm going to give this to, we're going to start with Oriana. What are some of the inequities around dealing with drug misuse in BIPOC communities?
Sure. So I think this actually loops us back to the beginning. It's all related to me. I hear it all in the same, right? So we should have never had law enforcement agencies come to talk to us about drugs. That was a big mistake. I mean, the curriculum was a mistake, but even just the presentation, the facilitators, that was a mistake, right? And they should have at least come in plain clothes, right? I mean, we just have an association with that has been so detrimental to us. So I would say the first thing for me is education, right? We need fact-based drug education, not education that scares us, not education that alarms us, not education that provides like falsities, right? Like the thought that cannabis is a gateway drug, that's not true. That's been debunked. It's inaccurate, right? The drug that actually tends to be the most dangerous for young people is alcohol. It's legal, right? Also, and this might be an advanced level kind of course, but you can do heroin and not get addicted. That's the war on drugs that makes us think that is the case. Now, I'm not saying that to say that people should be using opioids, but there's a lot of false information that was ingrained in our education, right? So I think our communities would benefit from having some fact-based education. Might be nice to have some people that look like us and sound like us to present that information. Other inequities. I also grew up in a family who, I mean, there was no older sibling or cousin or anybody that was doing psychedelics. They were drinking, they were smoking weed. That's basically it. So when it came to my time to be curious about these things, I really had no one to go to, right? So peer mentors, people that are not elders or older or that are coming into the school, but people that are of the same age, right? That can speak to each other about drug use, peer circles. That would be a great resource. In my white, very privileged, very wealthy private school that I went to for middle school and high school, they're now quickly figuring out how to get the best, drug education resources, peer circles implemented. How about that in my public school, right? How about that where I grew up in Yonkers? How about in the Black and brown schools that don't have access, also implementing those kind of structures to teach children about and young people about drugs? Another inequity, I would say, there's very far and few between Black and brown leaders that are open about their drug use. In the drug policy world and movement, we see them. Cassandra Federic, the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, the first Black executive director, is huge, huge, huge victory for us, right? Jason Ortiz, executive director for SSDP. But they're few and far between. I don't know many Black and brown executive directors that are like, yes, I use drugs all the time and I'm okay, right? There's not that kind of openness about it. And so in order to destigmatize, I think our communities, our young people would benefit from seeing their leaders speaking about their drug use in an honest and open way.
Thank you. Bryan, do you have any?
Yes. I see inequities as an opportunity for the church to do ministry, and ministry that is impactful. If the Narcan is not getting to our communities, then we have to bring it to our communities. If people aren't able to get into treatment programs, we've got to create some type of safe space or environment where people can come and be themselves and not be judged. And if professional treatment is necessary, then we need to figure out how to get people treated. So there's a lot. I think this is a great opportunity for faith communities to step up to the plate and to really be the hands and feet for God. And as I mentioned earlier, there's monies that are out there for things like this. And so we just have to, again, be creative and become aware of the tools that we have. So it is an opportunity for the church to do ministry. Jesus did ministry. Jesus saw people. He healed people. He touched people. He he didn't just stay in the church and say, we're worshiping, which is fine to worship, but there's work to do. Oftentimes, we say that we're social justice driven, but from my experience, a lot of the churches that I've seen and spaces of worship that I've seen, they are more of a social club than they are social justice. So we really have to think about doing the work of social justice. What does that mean? What does that require? And I think the gap that we have is the perfect opportunity to do the work.
Yes, great points. Great point, Bryan and Oriana. We have just a few moments left. I'm going to ask each of you to take 15 seconds for your final statements. Bryan, could you make your final statements? Any last points you want to make?
Yes. So as a faith community, I just wanted to remind us that Jesus said that we would do greater works. Even if you don't follow Jesus, just go with me. And so think about what greater works mean. Jesus touched people. He healed people. And when I say touch, we think of touch as something, he laid hands on people, I would say. We think of that as something super spiritual, but no, Jesus actually touched people. He put his hands on them. He made them feel human, which they are. And so he even touched people when they were bleeding, which was a sign of uncleanliness. And so if we're going to do greater works, we have to be like Jesus, and we have to be willing to get our hands dirty.
Oh, I love that. Oriana, last words, last statements.
Amen,
Last
Bryan.
point.
Thank you for that. Yes, I would say that I'm just moved right now by Bryan's words. Thank you. Jesus was a harm reductionist. Yes, Christ was a harm reductionist. And as an interfaith person, as an interfaith, hopefully emerging faith leader, God calls us to reduce the harms on this earth by any means necessary. In any way, we intervene. And so I just want to call all folks that are followers of God and followers of the divine to really consider getting a Narcan training. It's easy, it's free, it's simple. We can prevent deaths like our beloved Michael K. Williams.
Yes, thank you. My last statement is first of all, I would like to thank our audience for being here. I would love to thank our two panelists, which we've had this stirring and enlightening conversation, Bryan Simmons-Scie and Oriana Mayorga. And I would just love to leave with the audience to open your heart. Open your heart. We are experiencing so many things in this country as black and brown people, and so many things, so many ideologies and philosophies that divide us. However, if we focus on treating our neighbors as ourselves, giving help to others, removing boundaries and barriers, we can help save lives. And that's what this entire conversation has been about. And stop pointing fingers and start giving hugs, start shaking hands, start making yourself of service. And we can do this by removing stigma around drug use, stigma around sexuality, stigma around race, stigma, any of the isms. We can make this world a better place. We can offer healing, and we can expand our community by doing that. And so I would like to thank each of you for tuning in. We do have some links that have been provided for you for trainings or to get training on Narcan. And so we put that. We have articles that are available in the description field, that some of which we've referenced today in this conversation. And I would like to thank each of you for tuning in. Please come back next month on the third Thursday. of October. We look forward to seeing you. And we also just want to take a few moments before I say goodbye, a few moments of silence for Michael K. Williams, for those who struggle with substance misuse, and for those who have lost a battle with substance misuse. We're going to take just a few seconds, moment of silence. We just want us to come back and say thank you. We're sending you love. Join us next month. We look forward to seeing you, friends. Good night.